So today I want to look at real estate in Africa versus America. Now, the interesting thing about it is that there was a debate not too long ago here as to whether it is better to own versus to rent. Now, in my opinion, it's a lot better to own, especially if you're in Africa, than it is to rent. But if you're in the US, I think I would lean towards renting as opposed to owning. And here's why. Now, let's look at the African side of things. In Africa, when you buy a property, you own that property for the rest of your life. As soon as the transaction is cleared, you own it. You are allowed to die in that property. You're allowed to um, set up that property as an inheritance for somebody, and it will stay in your family's lineage or bloodline for forever. However, you would have to maintain that property, which is something that you don't have to do when you're renting. Because I am currently renting, and I believe soon I'll be able to move into a house. But with the beauty about renting, especially in the space that I am in right now, is I have amazing neighbors that I like, and so the security of my home is almost guaranteed by their presence. I can afford to just lock my door and disappear for days on end, which you might not be able to do with a house. You see, if you don't have somebody consistently living in the house, or if you don't have a form of security consistently in your house could easily get vandalized and burglared while you are away. And so you have to, and that's why in Africa, a lot of the times people get maids to stay in the houses, or they get askaris or security guards to guard the homes while they are away. In the US, they have home security systems, and those are a bit more advanced than what we might have here. But in Africa, a home security system might not be your best bet. You know, you would rather have somebody physically present in the event that somebody is trying to get into the house. So, as far as the maintenance is concerned, when you own your own home, you have to spend a lot of money on maintenance. But when you're renting, a lot of the wear and tear that happens to your home, you just bring that to the attention of your landlord, and ideally your landlord takes care of it. And so if you have a very responsive landlord like I do, they will handle those issues very quickly. Issues like with issues to do with water, issues to do with electricity, amongst other things. They will handle those things promptly, and so you don't have to worry about that. And so the security of your home when you're renting versus the maintenance of your home, those are things you do not have to worry about when you are renting, because your landlord is already worried about those things. But, however, if you ever come, if you ever get to a point in time where you run out of finances, and this is the challenge with renting, if let's say you lose your job temporarily or your business is not doing very well. I recently went through a period whereby business was not going so good and I was not really making any money. And so those periods can be very unsettling when you're renting, because your fear is that, will I be able to make next month's rent? And if you can't make next month's rent, it can be a very uncomfortable experience, and you could easily end up on the streets if you're renting. However, if you are living in your own home, you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about meeting next month's rent. Even the bills, if let's say you don't have money to pay for electricity, you don't have money to pay for water, you can just afford to wait until they cut the electricity off or they cut off the water, but they're not going to come and take the house. That's the beauty about it. You will still have a roof over your head. You might not have electricity or running water in the house, but you will at least have a roof over your head, and that speaks volumes. However, when you look at our brothers and sisters in the US, it's a very different situation. You see, if they are not paying rent, they're paying property tax. And so, which means that even though they own the house, they paid for the house outright, they still have to pay what I call rent to the government. And in my mind, that doesn't make any sort of sense. Why you still have to pay property tax to the government on a house that you bought and you own outright, and on top of that, it's a property that is not creating for you income. And so why would you have to pay the government that type of money? I don't know. And again, I'm not an American, and so I can't speak for them. I can't speak for their government, and that is their choice. But if you are paying property tax every fucking month, and you also have the option to pay rent and have somebody take care of some of the headaches of owning a home, then it's a better option for you to actually rent than it is for you to actually own a home in the US. Because if you own your own home, on top of having to do all of the maintenance on your house, and on top of that, if you want to do any type of changes to the house, and whether we're talking structural changes, external changes, maybe changes to the fence, you have to get permits, you have to get paperwork to do changes to your own home. And so the stress of customizing your own house to your own liking is considerably higher if you're in the US as opposed to if you were in Africa. But the benefits of being in the US is, in the event that you want to sell your home, it's a lot easier for you to find buyers there, and it's a lot easier for you to offload a property than it is here in Africa. Here in Africa, the more expensive your home is, the harder, and I mean this, the harder it is to get somebody to buy it. And so, because we also don't have the same level of financing that the American economy has, it is very difficult to get people, it's very difficult for people to sell off property. Now, that is looking at it from a home ownership perspective. If you're to look at it from a businessman's perspective, if I have two properties, one, I have a property that I could own and then sell off at once, or I have a property that I can rent out. What would be better, selling or renting? So I think that would depend on what your investment goals are. The challenge with selling is that it's a one-off transaction, meaning that in order for you to consistently create income, you have to be able to take the money that you have made from that sale, go and buy another cheaper property, and then hope to sell that property for a markup in the future. However, when it comes to renting, you have consistent monthly income. But the challenge that people don't tell you about the real estate business is that the real estate business, especially the renter business, is a time-based business. Let's do some very simple math. Let's say you have a property that is that you built for $100,000, right? You spent $100,000 building this property, and you are renting it out at, let's say, $1,000 a month in rent. That seems a lot, but we're making the assumption it's going to take you, basically in a year, your return is $12,000. It's going to take you roughly 8 to 9 years to recoup that investment. And that is with the assumption that there is a tenant in that property every single month, paying you every single month for the entire period of time. Now, if you ever go through a period whereby maybe your tenant refuses to pay, or you are stuck in a country whereby there's a lot of the tenant's protection system is very, very high, and it puts you, the landlord, in a very tight spot, you're going to have a very hard time squeezing rent out of some tenants who are very stubborn. But worst case scenario is you might end up in a situation whereby a tenant rents your property, spends 6 months there, does not pay, and then after they leave, they do damages to the house, you end up having to spend your own money, you end up having to come out of pocket to fix those damages, and then on top of that, you end up in a period where you cannot attract a new tenant for another 6 months. So you have a full year of no rent. And the challenge with that is, if you have a full year of no rent, that adds to the expected time of return on investment. Because remember, our original expected time would be 8 to 9 years for our $100,000 property that we are renting out at $1,000 a month. We would expect to recoup that investment in about 8 to 9 years. But if we have a period of 1 year where we have no rent coming in, that 1 year has to be added to the 9 years, and then it becomes 10 years. And so we would end up expecting our final return on investment in about 10 years. But the beauty about real estate to a degree is that the property goes up in value, and that's the benefit of it. But however, if you are not planning on selling the property and you're planning on keeping the property and you're trying to recoup your investment in the property by renting the property out, if that is your goal, then get ready to sit with that property for a while. And I mean a long time. So there are properties where people spend a lot of money, millions of dollars, billions of shillings, millions of dollars, building up these properties, and have never fully recouped the investment that they made into these properties. You find that some of the properties still have loans on them. You find that the tenants are not as many as they expected. For example, in Kampala, there are a lot of skyscrapers that are empty. There are a lot of buildings, maybe not skyscrapers, but there are a lot of big business buildings that are empty. You will find that the building has 6 floors, but only the first 2 to 3 floors are actually occupied. The remaining floors up are not occupied. And so you find that the landlord is trying to squeeze out his investment from 3 floors worth of tenants. And yet he spent money building 6 floors. And so because he wants to maintain his tenants, he cannot afford to overcharge them because he might scare them away and push them to another place. However, you might be, if depending on the quality of your property and the position of your property, you might be able to charge what you want. Because one of the most beautiful things about real estate is that it is location, location, location. Okay? Everything else can be fixed and can be managed. But if you don't have the right location, you just don't have the right location. And the beauty about it is, if you have the right location, nobody can take that from you. Nobody can set up a building on top of yours. Nobody can set up a building underneath yours. The closest they can do is set up a building right next to you. But nobody, absolutely nobody, will, if you have a prime location, nobody will have your prime location till the day you die, unless they buy the property from you. And so that is probably, in my opinion, the most beautiful thing about real estate, is that the competitive advantage, once it's acquired, it can never be lost. Unlike in a lot of other businesses whereby you can lose your competitive advantage. It can happen. But in real estate, you never lose it. So the conclusion to all of this is that if you are aiming to be, if you are in Africa and you want to choose between renting and owning a property, it is smarter to own a property when you have a family, because that's when it makes sense. Or when you are intending to build a family, because that's when it will make sense. If you are single, it is a smarter idea to live in a rental property, paying as little rent as possible. That would be a smarter idea, because that way there are so many other things that are outsourced that you don't have to do yourself. Like I mentioned earlier, the security of your home. When you're renting in an apartment complex, that is outsourced indirectly to your landlord and to your neighbors. Now, if you are someone in the US, I would advise you to rent and rent, because we don't, as Africans, we can't wrap our heads around the idea of property tax after you've bought the property. Now, if you're an investor and you're dealing with properties, the idea of should you be someone who buys and sells, or should you be someone who rents? If you are comfortable having this property in, let's say, your asset portfolio for a very long time, and you don't care very much about the date of return on investment, you don't really care about that date, feel free to rent out your property. You're going to be dealing with a lot of crazy tenants every now and then, but you will still have some type of money coming in every month, and on top of that, you'll be able to keep your property. If you don't want to deal with any of that havoc, feel free to be the type of person who acquires a property, waits a few years, and then sells it off. And that is a much, I would say, less stressful way of owning property and being in the property business. Although it requires a considerable amount of capital to start if you're in Africa. But if you're not in Africa and you're in America, all you need is a 10 to 20% down payment on almost any property, and you can have the rest financed to the bank. And I would say that is probably the one thing I envy about the real estate in America. It is fast, it is operational, it is well regulated, and on top of that, it is well financed. As opposed to Africa, whereby if you want to buy a property, 20% down is not going to work. You most likely will have to come up with at least 70% of the money, or in a lot of cases, if you're not buying a commercial property, or you're not setting up a commercial property, you are going to have to come up with 100% of the money. That's been Emma. Have a good one. So if you're enjoying the content, please feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps me grow the channel.